The drought had lasted for 10 million years, and the era of terrifying reptiles had long ended. On the continent later known as Africa, along the equator, the struggle for survival had reached a new peak of brutality, and the victor was not yet clear. On this desolate, cracked land, only the small, agile, or fierce creatures had any hope of thriving, or merely surviving. The apes of the savanna were neither small, agile, nor fierce, and so they reproduced poorly. In fact, they were already far along the road to extinction. High up in a small, sun-scorched valley, about 50 apes occupied a group of caves. 200 miles to the north, snow on the mountains melted into a stream that barely flowed through the valley's bottom. In this bad season, the stream had completely dried up, and this tribe of apes had to endure thirst. This tribe of apes was never well fed, and now they were suffering from famine. As the dawn's faint light shone into the cave, Moon Watcher noticed that his father had died during the night. He did not understand that the dead one was his father, as the concept of fatherhood was beyond him, but looking at the withered corpse, he felt a vague sense of unease. 2 infants were already crying for food, but when Moon Watcher growled at them, they quieted down again. The mother of one of the infants, protecting her underfed offspring, growled back at Moon Watcher. Tempted to strike her for her insolence, he found he lacked the strength. It was light enough to leave the cave now. Moon Watcher dragged the withered corpse, bending down to squeeze through the low-hanging entrance of the cave. Outside, he shouldered the corpse and stood upright. He was one of the few animals in this world that could stand on 2 legs. Moon Watcher was a giant among his kind, standing close to 5 feet tall. Despite malnutrition, he weighed more than 100 pounds. His body was covered in hair, with well-developed muscles, and he was half ape, half man. But his skull was more human than ape-like. His forehead was low, with prominent brow ridges, yet there was no doubt that he carried the genes that would evolve into humans. As he surveyed the Ice Age world filled with danger, his deep-set black eyes already gleamed with qualities surpassing ape intelligence. In those eyes was the nascent spark of awareness, the dawn of wisdom, which would take many ages to mature, and which could easily flicker out and never return. Seeing no sign of danger, Moon Watcher began descending the nearly vertical slope outside the cave, the burden on his shoulder hardly affecting him. The other apes of his tribe, seemingly waiting for his signal, now emerged from their shelters along the rock wall and hurried to the muddy stream to drink the first water of the day. Moon Watcher looked toward the other side of the valley to see if those apes had appeared, but there was no sign of them yet. Perhaps they had not left their caves, or maybe they had already gone far into the hills to forage. Since they were not in sight, Moon Watcher dismissed them from his mind. For now, he was focused on one thing. First, he had to get rid of the dead one, but this was a task requiring little thought. Many apes had died this season when the moon was waxing. A newborn had died in his cave. All Moon Watcher needed to do was leave the corpse where the dead infant had been discarded, and the hyenas would take care of the rest. At the open area where the valley met the plains, a group of hyenas was already waiting, almost as if they knew he would come. Moon Watcher dropped the corpse beneath a bush. The bones of previous dead had long since disappeared and hurried back to his tribe of apes. He never thought about his father again. His 2 mates, the other adult apes in the caves, and most of the young ones were out foraging among the withered trees in the depths of the valley, searching for berries, juicy roots, leaves, and the occasional lizard or mouse, rare delicacies. Only the infants and the weakest of the old ones remained in the caves. If the day's search yielded any surplus food, they might get fed. If not, the hyenas would soon have more luck. But today's harvest was not bad, although, without any true memory of the past, Moon Watcher had no way to compare it. He found a beehive inside the stump of a dead tree and enjoyed the best delicacy ever tasted by an ape. By evening, as he led the group of apes back to the cave, he was still licking his fingers. Of course, he had been stung numerous times, but he paid little attention to that. He felt a rare sense of satisfaction, perhaps one of the few times in his life he would ever feel this way. For though he had not eaten enough, he no longer felt so weak from hunger. This was the highest expectation an ape could achieve. As he approached the stream, his satisfaction vanished. Those apes were on the other side. They were there every day, and every day they were just as annoying. There were about 30 of them, indistinguishable from Moonwatcher's own tribe. As soon as they saw him, they began leaping about and screeching from the far side of the stream. Moonwatcher's tribe responded in kind. The confrontation lasted about 5 minutes. The sudden display ended just as suddenly, and everyone drank their fill of the muddy water. Honor had been upheld. Both sides had asserted their claim to the territory. With that business done, the other tribe retreated along their side of the stream. The nearest grazing ground was now more than a mile away from the caves, and they had to share it with creatures like the antelope-like beasts, which barely tolerated their presence. These large animals, armed with deadly blades on their foreheads, were equipped with natural weapons that the apes did not have, so they couldn't drive them away. So, Moonwatcher and his companions chewed leaves and wild fruits to stave off their hunger, unaware that the very animals they foraged alongside were the potential source of a great feast that was beyond their imagination. There was plenty to go around, yet they were slowly starving to death. In the twilight, the tribe of apes returned safely to their caves. The injured female ape left behind in the cave chirped with joy when she saw the branch full of berries that Moonwatcher had brought back, eagerly grabbing and devouring them. Though they provided little nourishment, they would help sustain her until her wounds from the leopard's bite healed and she could forage again. From one of the lower caves at the base of the slope, there came sounds of shrieks and cries, and Moonwatcher, half awake, knew exactly what was happening without needing to hear the occasional roar of a leopard. In the darkness below, Old Whitehair and his family were struggling, dying, but the thought of trying to help never crossed Moonwatcher's mind. The harsh logic of survival ruled out such fantasies. Though the air was filled with screams and howls all around the mountainside, not a single protest was heard. Each cave was silent, fearing to attract trouble. The noise soon subsided, and Moonwatcher could hear the sound of a body being dragged over the rocks. It took only a few moments. Then the leopard had its prey in its jaws. Carrying the victim in its mouth, it moved off silently into the night. Moonwatcher climbed out of the cave and perched on a large rock at the cave's entrance, crouching there as he watched the valley. He alternated between observing the valley and gazing at the moon, but all the while, he kept his ears alert. He dozed once or twice, but even in sleep, he was highly vigilant, waking at the slightest sound. Although he was 25 years old, his senses were still sharp. If he continued to be lucky, avoiding accidents, disease, predators, and hunger, he might live another 10 years. The night deepened, cold and clear. No more alarming incidents occurred. The moon slowly rose higher, and a few constellations, invisible to the naked eye due to the equatorial horizon, shone brightly above. In the fitful sleep of waiting, the kind later generations would call a nightmare began. A brilliant beam of light, brighter than any star, slowly crossed the sky twice, rising to the zenith before disappearing to the east. In the dead of night, Moonwatcher suddenly woke up. He sat up in the foul-smelling darkness of the cave, straining to listen to the sounds of the night outside, feeling a growing sense of fear. In his entire life, a life that had already lasted twice as long as most of his kind could expect to live, he had never heard anything like this before. Leopards and tigers moved quietly, only revealing their presence with the occasional slipping of soil or the breaking of a branch. But this was a continuous grinding sound, getting louder and louder. It sounded like some giant creature was moving through the night, without trying to hide or paying attention to any obstacles. Moonwatcher distinctly heard the sound of a bush being uprooted, something elephants often did, but elephants, like leopards, moved quietly. Then came a sound Moonwatcher couldn't identify because it had never been heard before in the history of the world: the sound of metal striking stone. When Moonwatcher led his tribe down to the river at dawn, they came across the new stone on the opposite bank. Because nothing had happened after the initial noise, Moonwatcher had almost forgotten the terror of the night and didn't associate this strange object with danger or fear. The strange object was a rectangular slab, 3 times Moonwatcher's height, but no thicker than he could grasp with both hands. It was made of a completely transparent material, and if not for the reflected glint of the rising sun on its edges, it would have been difficult to see. Since Moonwatcher had never encountered ice, nor even seen clear water. He couldn't compare this strange thing to anything in nature. It was certainly very intriguing, though Moonwatcher was usually cautious around new things. But this object didn't make him hesitate for long. Soon he approached it. Since it remained still, he even reached out and touched its cold, hard surface. After a few minutes of concentrated thought, he came up with a clever explanation. It must be a rock, one that had grown overnight. Many plants grew in this way. Those white, fleshy things, like small pebbles, seemed to sprout from the soil in just a few hours of darkness. After only 3 or 4 minutes, spurred by this truly remarkable abstract reasoning, Moonwatcher reached a conclusion and acted upon it. Those white, fleshy plants were edible, although some caused violent illness. Maybe this tall thing could be. He licked it a few times and even bit it. He quickly realized it was inedible. As a sensible ape, he continued on his way to the river, as usual screaming at those apes, and promptly forgot about the crystal-like slab. At dusk, they hurriedly drank from the stream while keeping an eye out for the beasts that foraged early, and then began climbing back to their caves. They were still 100 yards away from the new stone when they began to hear the sound. It was barely audible but made them all stop in their tracks, standing frozen halfway up the path, jaws agape. It was a monotonous, rhythmic throbbing, maddening to hear, emanating intermittently from that transparent object, leaving all who heard it dumbfounded. For the first time on the African continent, and for the last time in 3 million years, the sound of drumming was heard. The throbbing grew louder and faster. The apes, like sleepwalkers, began to shuffle toward the source of the compelling sound. The rhythm of the drumming, which their descendants would one day create themselves, already resonated with their pulse, causing them to step in rhythm as they danced closer. They gathered around the stone, completely entranced, forgetting everything. The day's exhaustion, the dangers of the night, and the hunger gnawing at their stomachs. The drumming grew louder, the night darker. Shadows lengthened, the light in the sky faded, and the crystal began to glow. The crystal slowly became less transparent, suffused with a faint, milky luminescence. Indistinct, elusive shapes moved across its surface and within its depths. The images coalesced into beams of light and shadow, crossing in radial patterns that scattered in all directions and began to rotate. The faster the wheel of light spun, the quicker the rhythm of the drumming. The apes were utterly mesmerized, staring in wide-eyed wonder at this fireworks-like display. They had forgotten all their instincts passed down through generations and the lessons of their own lives. Normally, they would never venture so far from the caves this late, for as they stopped all activity to watch, the bushes around them were full of unmoving forms and pairs of wide-open eyes. They had no idea their minds were being probed, their bodies measured, their reactions studied, their potential assessed. At first, the apes stood half-bent like a group of clay statues, motionless. Then, the ape closest to the slab suddenly woke up. He did not move from his spot, but his body shook off its paralysis and began to move, as if manipulated by invisible strings. His head swayed from side to side, his mouth opened and closed, his hands clenched and released. Then he bent down, picked up a long piece of grass, and tried awkwardly to tie it into a knot with his clumsy fingers. He struggled like a puppet controlled by some spirit or demon, trying to free himself. He panted, his eyes full of terror, as he forced his hands to perform a task he had never done before. Despite his great effort, he ended up tearing the grass to pieces. As the shredded grass fell to the ground, the force controlling him released its grip, and he once again froze in place. Another ape began to move, performing the same actions. He was younger and more adaptable. Where the older one had failed, he succeeded. And thus, the first primitive grass knot appeared on the planet Earth. When it was Moonwatcher's turn, he didn't feel much fear. His primary sensation was a vague frustration because the twitching of his muscles and the movement of his limbs didn't entirely follow his own will. He bent down without realizing it, picked up a small stone, and, standing upright again, saw a new image appear in the crystal slab. The grid and moving, jumping patterns had vanished, replaced by a set of concentric circles, all centered around a small black disk. Obeying the silent command in his mind, he raised the stone above his head and awkwardly threw it. The stone missed by several feet. "Try again," the command said. He searched around and found another small stone. This time, it hit the slab with a ringing sound. Still far from the target, but an improvement in aim. On his fourth try, the stone missed the center by only a few inches. An indescribable pleasure, as intense as beautiful excitement, flooded his mind. Then the control loosened. He no longer felt any compulsion and just stood there, waiting. One by one, the whole tribe of apes was briefly taken over. Some succeeded, but most failed to complete the assigned task. Yet all were rewarded with pleasure or punished with pain accordingly. Then, as if waking from a dream, the apes shook their heads and began to make their way back along the path to the caves. None of them looked back, nor were they astonished by the strange light guiding them home. The crystal no longer fascinated their minds, nor did it continue to experiment on their bodies. Moon Watcher and his companions could no longer remember what they had witnessed. The next day, as they passed by the crystal while foraging, they didn't give it a second thought, simply treating it as part of the background of life that required no attention. They couldn't eat it, and it couldn't eat them, so it was of no importance. At the riverbank, those apes once again issued their usual ineffective threats. Their leader, a one-eared ape similar in size and age to Moon Watcher, but physically weaker, even briefly invaded Moon Watcher's territory, screaming loudly and waving his arms, trying to demoralize the opposition and bolster his own pride. The water in the stream was no deeper than a foot, but the one-eared leader hesitated and became uncomfortable the further he waded in. He soon stopped, then turned back, pretending to maintain his dignity as he returned to his group. Other than this, the daily routine remained unchanged. The tribe of apes gathered just enough food to survive for another day, and there were no deaths. That night, the crystal slab continued to pulse with light and sound, waiting. However, its carefully planned program had changed. It now ignored certain apes, focusing its attention on those it deemed most promising. One of these was Moon Watcher. Once again, he felt sensitive tendrils probing into the rarely used corners of his mind. Then, he began to see visions. What he saw was a peaceful family scene, with only one difference from the life he knew. The couple and two infants who mysteriously appeared before him were well-fed, their skin shiny and slick with fat, a condition of life that Moon Watcher could never have imagined. Unconsciously, he touched his own prominent ribs. The ribs of those creatures were covered in layers of fat. They lazily shifted now and then, reclining near the entrance of a cave, entirely content with the world. The adult male occasionally belched loudly, a sign of satisfaction. There were no other activities, and after 5 minutes, the vision suddenly disappeared. The crystal returned to its outline, glowing faintly in the darkness. Moon Watcher shook his head, as if waking from a deep dream, and led his tribe back to the cave. Though he couldn't consciously recall the vision, that night, as he sat brooding at the cave entrance, his ears attuned to the familiar sounds of the night, Moon Watcher felt the first pangs of a new and powerful emotion. It was a growing sense of envy, a vague dissatisfaction with his own life. He couldn't understand the source of this feeling, much less how to overcome it, but the discontent had entered his soul, and with it, he took a small step toward becoming human. By the time of the next new moon, 2 of the tribe had died, and 1 had been born. One death was from hunger. The other occurred during one of the nightly rituals, when an ape collapsed while trying to strike 2 stones together skillfully. As soon as the ape fell, the crystal's light immediately went out, and the tribe was released from its trance. The fallen ape never moved again, and by morning, the body had disappeared. The next night, there was no performance. The crystal was analyzing its own mistakes. At dusk, when the apes passed by the crystal, they paid no attention to it. On the 3rd night, the crystal was ready to experiment again. Those 4 fat apes were still there, but this time they were performing unusual actions. Moon Watcher began to tremble uncontrollably. He felt as though his mind would burst, and he wanted to look away, but the relentless mental control would not release its grip. He was forced to complete the lesson, despite all his instincts rebelling. Those instincts had once served his ancestors well. In the past, when the weather was warm, the rains plentiful, and the land fertile, food was abundant and easy to obtain. But the times had changed, and what had once been wisdom had now become folly. The apes needed to adapt to the changing world or face extinction, just like the great beasts whose bones had already turned to fossils. And so, Moon Watcher stared intently at the crystal slab, allowing his mind to be manipulated in ways he couldn't comprehend. He frequently felt nauseous and was constantly aware of his hunger. His hands, seemingly without his conscious control, clenched into the posture that would soon determine his new way of life. A long line of warthogs snorted and shuffled across the path, and Moon Watcher suddenly stopped. In the past, pigs and apes had always ignored each other, as there was no conflict between them. Like all animals that did not compete for the same food, they usually avoided interaction, treating each other with cautious indifference. But this time, Moon Watcher stood still, watching the warthogs, struggling with an impulse he couldn't understand, unsure of what to do. Then, as if in a dream, he began searching the ground for what, even if he could speak, he would not have been able to explain. He would know it when he saw it. What he saw was a heavy, sharp-edged stone, about 6 inches long, not ideal, but good enough. He hefted it in his fist, confused by the added weight, yet feeling a pleasing sense of power and authority. He began to run toward the nearest warthog. Even by warthog standards, this was a young and foolish creature. Although it caught sight of Moon Watcher from the corner of its eye, it didn't take him seriously at first. Why would it suspect that this gentle animal had any ill intentions? It continued munching grass, unaware of the stone hammer that struck it unconscious. The killing was swift and efficient, and the other warthogs didn't even notice, continuing to graze undisturbed. The other apes had been watching in silence. Now they gathered around Moon Watcher and his prey, a mixture of envy and astonishment in their eyes. One ape picked up the blood-stained weapon and began beating the dead pig. Others joined in, grabbing sticks and stones and striking the body until it was reduced to a bloody pulp. When the beating was done, they felt bored. Some wandered off, while others hesitated around the now unrecognizable carcass. The future of the world awaited their decision. Strangely, it was only after a considerable amount of time that a mother ape, cradling her infant, bent down and licked the blood from the stone in her hand. Despite all the demonstrations Moon Watcher had witnessed, it took him even longer to fully grasp the realization that from now on, he would never have to worry about hunger again. However, the apes needed other help, because their teeth and nails could only shred rabbits, but nothing bigger. Fortunately, nature had already provided the most suitable tools, waiting for their intelligence to develop enough to utilize them. In the first place, there is a crude but effective knife and saw of a pattern that has served the apes well for 3 million years. That is the ready-made jawbone of the antelope with teeth, an instrument which will not be materially improved until steel is invented. There are also the horns of the small antelope, which make ready awls or daggers, and the complete jaw of almost any small animal can be made into a scraping instrument. Stone clubs, tooth saws, horn blades, bone scrapers, these are the divine inventions by which the apes have survived. The apes have had this first good fortune. The opportunity will not come again. The future will be virtually entirely in their own hands. The apes were no longer rendered obstinate by hunger. They had leisure and time for the most preliminary thoughts. They had become so accustomed to their new way of life that no one connected it with the new way of life, even though the slab was still standing beside the river path. If they even paused to consider what had happened, they only boasted that they had achieved their improved position by their own efforts. In fact, they had long forgotten that there had been any other way of living. There were occasional days of scarcity for that tribe of apes, though they no longer threatened their existence. One day they had not hunted anything until dusk. Moonwatch led his weary, discontented companions home to the promise of a cave. It was at the door of their cave that they found a rare offer of good fortune from nature. A mature oryx lies next to the trail. One of its front legs is broken, but its fighting spirit has not diminished. The jackals that surround it are still far away from its bladed horns. The jackals are not afraid to wait. They understand that they have only to wait for an opportunity. But the jackals forgot the competition for survival, and had to retreat resentfully when the apes arrived. The apes, too, circled carefully, keeping out of reach of those dangerous horns. Then they began to attack with clubs and stones. The attack was not carried out very effectively or harmoniously, and by the time the poor sheep was dead, it was nearly full dark. The jackals had regained their courage. Wang Yu was in a dilemma. To abandon it was to go hungry, to stay was to be afraid, and gradually he realized that perhaps he had wasted his breath. It was too dangerous to stay any longer. Then, by no means for the first or last time, he showed to be a genius. After great effort, he visualized placing the dead antelope in a safe place in his own cave. He began dragging the antelope towards the cliffs. The other apes at once understood his intention and rallied to his assistance. If he had known the difficulty of the task beforehand, he would not have tried it. It was only his brute strength and the agility inherited from his tree-climbing ancestors that enabled him to drag the carcass up the steep slope. Several times, faced with defeat, he was so sad that he wept and almost abandoned the quarry, but a toughness of character, as old as hunger, drove him to persevere. The other apes were sometimes a help, sometimes a hindrance, and mostly in the way. At last, however, success was achieved. The bloody antelope was dragged into the mouth of the cave, by which time the remaining light of the sun had faded in the sky, and the munching began. A few hours later, a gut-full and bloated lookout woke up with a start. For some reason, he sat up in the darkness, his equally well-fed companions lying sprawled out all around him, while he strained to hear movement in the darkness outside. Nothing could be heard but the low snoring around him. The whole outside world seemed to be asleep. The rock outside the cave entrance was as white as bone under the high light of the bright moon. Any premonition of disaster seemed absolutely impracticable. Then, from a distance away, came the sound of a stone hitting the ground. Fearful and curious, Lookout Moon climbed to the rocky shelf outside the cave and gazed down toward the crags below. The sight of it made him so frightened that he was unable to move his limbs for a long time. 20 feet below, two golden eyes were looking straight upward at him, and they frightened him so that he lost all sense of the quick, flowery body behind them, which was leaping swiftly and noiselessly over the rocks and into the stream. The leopard had never climbed so high. It must have known full well that the caves were inhabited by apes, but it did not visit the lower caves. It was after some other target. Following the trail of blood, it climbed the moonlit cliffs seconds later, the darkness of the night intensified by the alarming screams of the apes in the upper caves. The panther, realizing that it had lost the element of surprise, roared, but it did not stop, for it knew it had nothing to fear. The panther used the rocky ledge to take a moment's rest in that narrow open space. Blood could be smelled everywhere, causing its ferocious, undeveloped mind to focus on an overwhelming desire. No longer hesitating, it stepped lightly into the hole. It was at this point that the leopard made its first mistake. For once it stepped out of the moonlight, even its superb luminous eyes had a momentary lapse. The leopard's back was half reflected in the cave, and the apes saw it more clearly than it saw the apes. They were very frightened, but they were no longer completely helpless. The leopard roars with haughty confidence, waving his long tail, and strides forward in search of the tender meat he so eagerly desires. If he had met his prey in the open air, he would have had no trouble. But the apes had no way of retreating, and the desperate need for survival made them extraordinarily brave. Moreover, for the first time they had the means of success. The panther felt a fuming blow to the head and realized something was wrong. It lunged with both front paws, its claws clawing into tender flesh and causing a wail. A sharp object then stabbed into its side and back, causing pain through the heart. One stab, then another, then three. It whirled around in an attempt to attack the shrieking and jumping figures that surrounded it. The panther took another hard blow to the snout. It opened its teeth toward a blur of moving white light, only to gnaw on a useless white bone. Finally, humiliated beyond belief, its tail was uprooted. The panther turned around again and slammed an emboldened executioner against the wall of disaster. But no matter how it struggled, it could never escape the rain of crashes, the pounding of clumsy but powerful fists wielding crude weapons. Its roar faded in pitch, from pain and shock to unadulterated fear. The insatiable predator then became the hunted, desperately attempting to exit the battlefield. It went on to make a second mistake, for in its shock and fear, it forgot where it was. Perhaps dazed by the hammer blows raining down on its head, it leapt out of the cave. With a horrible cry, it fell out of nowhere onto the rock. It seemed a long time before it fell with a coaxing thud on a protruding rock halfway up the crag. Then all that could be heard was the sound of sliding debris, and soon the echoes were lost in the darkness. In the intoxication of his victory, Wang Yu danced and stammered into the mouth of the cave. He correctly realized that his entire realm had undergone a change. He was no longer a powerless victim of the forces around him. He then went back into the cave and, for the first time in his life, got a full night's sleep. The next morning the apes found the body of the leopard at the foot of the crag. This subdued devil, even in death, kept everyone from approaching for a long time. But the apes then approached with bone knives and bone saws in hand. The job was quite daunting, and they didn't go out hunting again this day. As Lookout Moon led his clan of apes down the river valley in the dim light of dawn, he stopped unsure at a familiar spot. He knew there was one thing missing, but he couldn't remember exactly what it was. He didn't bother his head about it, for there were more important things on his mind this morning. He would never know what the crystal plate had done to him, and none of his companions, as they gathered behind him in the morning mist, wondered why he hesitated here for a moment on his way down to the river valley. The apes, on their own side of the riverbank, in the safety of their own territory, which had never been invaded, saw in the morning sunlight the Wang Qi and a dozen males of his clan, at first as a mere tuft of hair. Immediately they began to call out like sentinels taking inventory, but this time, unlike usual, there was no answer. With steady, purposeful steps especially, without a word, Watchful Moon and his band of men descended the hilly terrain that towered over the river. And as they drew nearer, those apes suddenly became silent. Their routine calls went still and were replaced by a growing fear. They realized, though not explicitly, that something new had happened. Realizing that this encounter would be very different from the past, Moonwatch's group stopped at the water's edge, and for a moment those apes regained their courage. Under the leadership of One Ear, they half-heartedly resumed their war song. But only a few seconds into the song, they were stunned by a horrible image. Lookout Moon raised his arm high in the air, exposing the object in his hand that had hitherto been hidden behind his partner's long hair all over his body. In his hand was a thick branch with a bloody leopard's head sticking out of it. The leopard's bloody mouth was held open by the branch, and its rows of fangs glowed eerily white in the morning sun. Most of those apes were too frightened to move, and some slowly staggered back. It was this sign of encouragement that Wang Yu was waiting for. Holding the bloody trophy aloft, he began wading across the river. His companions, after a moment's hesitation, swarmed across as well. One Ear was still holding his ground when the moon rose to the other side of the river. He did not flee, perhaps because he was brave, perhaps because he was stupid, perhaps even because he found it hard to believe that such a violation had really taken place. Coward or hero, it made no difference in the end. His ignorant mind took a hard blow from the leopard's head. Looking at the moon, Jean stood beside the newly defeated general, at a loss for words, momentarily struggling to comprehend the miraculous deed of a dead panther still being able to bite. At this point he became the master of the world and was at a loss as to what to do next. But he'll think of something to do. A new kind of animal flourished on Earth, gradually moving out from the heart of Africa. They were still so few in number that a hasty survey might have gone unnoticed, for the land oceans of that time were filled with hundreds of millions of creatures. It's hard to say yet whether this new animal would have survived, let alone thrived. In a world where so many raptors and giants are extinct, the future of this new animal is uncertain. In the hundreds of thousands of years since the crystals landed in Africa, the apes have invented nothing. However, they had begun to change, developing skills that no other beast possessed. The giant teeth of the apes are getting smaller and smaller because they are no longer so useful. Angled stones, which can be used to dig up roots and cut through hard flesh or fibers, have sufficed in place of sharp teeth and have produced incalculable results. The apes, whose teeth are injured or worn out, will no longer starve on account of it, and the coarsest tools will prolong their life for many years. The fangs were gone, and the shape of their faces began to change. The protruding mouths retreated, the large jaws were more graceful, and the mouths could produce clearer sounds. Language was still a million years away, but the first steps towards it had already been taken. At the same time, the world began to change. For ice ages, each separated by 200,000 years, swept over the land, leaving scars all over the planet. With the exception of the tropics, all creatures that had left their ancestral homelands prematurely were wiped out by the glacial assaults. Like seeds being sifted, anything that could not adapt to the glaciers was eliminated. As the glacier passed away, so did most of the earliest creatures on Earth, including the apes. Unusually, the apes left descendants. They didn't simply die out, they were transformed. The ones that made tools were reborn from their own tools. By the use of clubs and flint, the hands of the apes became dexterous in a way that is unparalleled in the whole of the beasts, thus enabling them to make better tools, which in turn brought their limbs and minds even further forward. It was an ever-accelerating, ever-accumulating process. The end result was man. In contrast to the beasts who only know the present, humans have acquired knowledge of the past and have begun to explore the future. Humans were also learning to harness nature. Thanks to the mastery of fire, humans laid the foundations for technology and have since moved far from their origins as beasts. Stone tools gave way to steel and then to iron. Hunting gave way to domesticity. Tribes grew into villages, which evolved into towns. Languages were immortalized by carvings in stone, pottery, and paper leather. Humans then invented philosophy and even religion. They placed their image in the heavens, and it would not be inaccurate to say that they existed in the well of the gods. As man's physical strength grew weaker and weaker, his means of attack became more and more formidable. From stone, to bronze, to iron, to steel, man has made all kinds of piercing and slashing weapons, and they have long since learned to kill and maim their enemies at long distances. Guns and spears, bows and arrows, guns and artillery, and even ballistic missiles have given mankind weapons of infinite distance and near infinite power. To this day, however, people are already precarious when weapons exist. No matter how many times you leave Earth, Dr. Haywood Floyd thought to himself, it's always hard to contain the excitement. He had been to Mars once, to the Moon 3 times, and to various space stations more times than he could remember. But as the time for takeoff approached, he was still aware of a growing nervousness, a sense of wonder and awe and, yes, some restlessness in that sense. It would be hard to distinguish him from any Terran baptized in space for the first time. After taking brief instructions from the president at midnight, he had traveled here by jet plane part way from Washington and was at that moment descending toward one of the sites in all the world that was familiar to him, but most exciting to him. Here were displayed the first and second signs of the space age, stretching 20 miles along the Florida coast. To the south were huge Saturnian and Neptunian stands surrounded by a ring of cautionary red lights, the kind of spacecraft that had sent men to the planets, now retired from the history books. On the far horizon, a gleaming silver tower stood amidst the columns of searchlight, the last Saturn V, the object of national remembrance and veneration for 20 years. Not far from it loomed, like a man-made mountain, the giant structure of the Vertical Assembly Hall, still the largest building on Earth. Then the tiny human figures hurrying to and fro on the ground made him realize the true size of that craft. The narrow part of the V-shaped wing was probably 200 feet wide, too. And now this giant machine is waiting specifically for me, Floyd thought with a touch of wonder and a touch of pride. As far as he knew, this was the first time an entire operation had been launched to send a single man to the moon. "I'm sorry I can't say anything, but you did meet the president tonight, Law?" A familiar voice asked. "Oh, Mike, hecko. I'm afraid you've been dragged out of bed for nothing." Absolutely no comment. "Can you at least confirm or deny that some kind of contagion is occurring on the moon?" A TV reporter asked, running to keep up as he pointed his miniature TV camera at Floyd. "Sorry," Floyd said, shaking his head. "What about isolation and quarantine?" Another reporter asked. "How long is the quarantine?" Still no comment. Dr. Floyd questioned a very short but determined female reporter. What possible pretext could there be for such a total news blackout on the moon? Is there any connection with the current political situation? What's the current political situation? Floyd asked her coldly. This provoked a chuckle, followed by a shout of bon voyage, doctor, and he ducked into the dais of the boarding ship. As far as he could remember, it was not a situation but a prolonged crisis. Since the 1970s, the world had hinged on two problems that had ironically been canceling each other out. Although birth control is inexpensive, reliable, and supported by all major religions, it was introduced too late. The world's population has now reached 6 billion, one-third of them in China. Some centralized powers have passed laws limiting the number of children a couple can have to 2, but enforcement has proved impractical. As a result, there are food shortages in every country. Even the United States has meatless days. While the need for international cooperation is more urgent than ever, the problem of frontier rivalries has not diminished since earlier times. In a million years, mankind had lost little of its aggressive instincts. Along symbolic borders visible only to politicians, 38 nuclear powers guarded each other with hostile intent. Together, these nations possess millions of tons of nuclear weapons, enough to wipe out the entire surface of the planet in one fell swoop. Although so far miraculously no atomic weapons had been used, that situation could not be sustained for long. The slim stewardess greeted him as he walked into the cockpit. "Good morning, Dr. Floyd. I'm Simmons Jr. on behalf of Captain Tynes and First Officer Ballard, the Deputy Minister. I'd like to welcome you aboard." "Thank you," Floyd says with a smile, wondering why the stewardess always sounds like a tour guide robot. "Take off in 5 minutes," she said, reaching out and motioning to the empty 20-seat cabin. "You may sit wherever you like, but Captain Tynes suggests the seat to the left of the front window, if you wish to observe the departure activities." "That's it," he replied, making his way to that particular seat. The stewardess greeted him for a moment before walking back to her own little room at the back of the cabin. Floyd settled back in his seat, adjusted the safety devices around his waist and shoulders, and strapped his paper bag on the seat next to him. A moment later, the loudspeaker began to emit a soft, thumping sound. "Good morning," said Miss Simmons' voice. "This is the third special flight, from JFK to Space Station 1. It seemed that for the sake of the lone passenger, she was also determined to tell the routine set from beginning to end. And Floyd couldn't help but smile as she tenaciously went on. "Our flight time is 55 minutes. Maximum acceleration is 2g, and there are 30 minutes of impending weightlessness. Please do not leave your seat until the safety signal is given." Floyd whipped his head around and shouted, "Thank you." For a split second, he sees a somewhat awkward but charming smile. He leaned back toward the back of his chair to steady himself and relax his body. He calculated that the trip would cost the taxpayers over $1 million. If it didn't produce results, he would be suspended. But he could always go back to the university and resume his interrupted study of planetary architecture. The automatic counting program starts together. The captain's voice came through the loudspeaker. It used the calming monotone accent common to wireless phones. 1 minute to high rise. As usual, that minute was more like an hour. Floyd felt a deep sense of tremendous power building up around him. In the fuel tanks of the two spaceplanes, the energy of a nuclear bomb was enclosed in the power storage system in the launch orbit, and all of it would be expended in sending him a mere 200 miles from Earth. No more old-fashioned 543210 calls, which are too stressful on the human nervous system. 15 seconds to launch. Start breathing deeply. It can be more comfortable. It's great for the psyche and great for the physiology. Floyd felt his lungs filled with oxygen. Dare to deal with it all. When the launch orbit began to carry that 1,000-ton load over the Atlantic, it was hard to tell when they broke orbit and took off into the air. But as the rocket roar suddenly redoubled in intensity and Floyd found himself sinking deeper and deeper into the cushions of his seat, he knew that the first stage engines had taken over and were running. He wished he could look out the window, but it took some effort to even turn his head. However, he didn't feel uncomfortable. In fact, the pressure of acceleration, the overwhelming thunder of the engines, also produced an unusual sense of comfort. His ears were ringing and his heart was pounding, and he felt more energized than he had in years. He was young again, and he wanted to sing loudly and joyfully, which ensured that no one could hear him. The emotion passed quickly, and he suddenly understood that he was leaving Earth, leaving everything he had ever loved. On the lower Earth were his 3 children, motherless since his wife had made that fateful flight to Europe 10 years ago. Has it been 10 years? It can't be. Yet it has been 10 years. Maybe he should have married again for their sake. He had almost lost track of time when the pressure and noise suddenly abated, when the small room announced, "Prepare to disengage from the lower levels. Begin." There was a little vibration, and suddenly Floyd recalled a Leonardo da Vinci quote that he had once hung in the offices of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration: "Big Bird will take off on the back of Big Bird and bring glory to the nesting niche in which it was born." Well, Big Bird is now flying far beyond anything Leonardo da Vinci ever dreamed of, and the power-drained partner is flying back to Earth. The empty lower stage will glide along a 10,000-mile arc into the atmosphere, trading speed for distance, back to Kennedy Airport. In a few hours, after overhauling and refueling, it would be ready to send another partner into the splendor of the heavens where it could never go on its own. Now Floyd thought, we're on our own, halfway to reaching orbit. The force of propulsion was much more moderate as the advanced rockets powered up and regained acceleration. In fact, he felt no more than the usual force of gravity. But getting up and walking was out of the question, for the opposite side of the cabin was up toward the front of the ship. If he had been so foolish as to leave his seat, he would have fallen at once against the back wall of the cabin. The effect was a little unsettling, for the craft seemed to stand upright on its tail. To Floyd, who sat at the very front of the cabin, all the seats seemed to be nailed to a wall below him vertically. He was doing his best to dispel this illusion when suddenly dawn broke outside the ship. Within seconds they had broken through a curtain of stark, pink, gold, and blue and entered the dazzling daylight. And despite the thick coloring on the windows to dampen the glare, the sunlight that slowly swept across the cabin at that moment still illuminated Floyd almost blindly for several minutes. He has entered space, yet has no problem seeing the stars. He covered his brow with his hands and tried to peer out the window beside him. Outside, the swept wings of the ship reflected the sunlight like white-hot metal on fire. All around the ship was absolute darkness, and in actuality that darkness must have been filled with stars just invisible to the naked eye. The weight was slowly decreasing. The rockets were controlled by throttling and speed regulation as the ship's circulation slid into orbit. The thunder of the engines dropped to a muffled roar, which diminished to a soft hiss, and finally silence. Floyd would have drifted out of his seat if there hadn't been a belt to strangle him. His stomach rather felt like it was going to do so anyway. He hoped that the pills he'd taken half an hour earlier, that is, before he'd even sailed 10,000 miles, would do what the instructions said they would do. In his life's work, he'd only passed out once on a cosmic voyage, but once wasn't too little. The captain's voice through the cabin loudspeaker was firm and confident. "Please observe all OG regulations. In 45 minutes we will be docking at Space Station 1. The stewardess walked down the narrow aisle to the right of the poorly spaced seats. Her gait was slightly wobbly, her feet barely sticking to the ground as if they were glued together. She walked without leaving the bright yellow Velcro carpet that ran from one end of the cabin to the other, and the roof from one end to the other. The carpet, as well as the soles of her shoes, were covered with a myriad of fine hooks that could be hooked together like burdocks. In a free-fall environment, this walking technique is a great calming influence on an overwhelmed passenger. "Would you like some coffee or tea, Dr. Floyd?" She hightailed it to the same. "No, thank you," he said with a smile. He always felt like a baby when he had to jerk on one of those plastic drinking straws. He opened his briefcase with a thud, intending to remove the papers, when the stewardess was still circling beside him with concern. "Dr. Floyd, may I ask you a question?" "Sure," he replied, his eyes looking at her from above his glasses. "My fiancé is a geologist in Tycho," Miss Simmons said, choosing her words carefully, "and I haven't heard from him in over a week." "Yeah? Maybe he left the base and couldn't be reached." She shook her head. "Whenever that happens, he always tells me off beforehand. You can imagine how worried I was and the rumors. Is it true that there are infectious diseases on the moon? Even if it is, there is no reason to panic. Remember, there was a quarantine in 1998, and that was because the flu virus mutated. So many people got sick, but not a single person died. And that's all I can say. He concluded firmly. Miss Simmons smiled quickly and straightened up. Thank you anyway, doctor. I'm sorry to have disturbed you. That's all right, he said solicitously, but not truthfully. Then he buried himself into the endless pile of technical reports, attempting a defiant final assault on the usually all-encompassing backlog. When he gets to the moon, he won't have time to read the material. A few minutes later, he opened his eyes for the first time and saw Space Station 1, only a few miles away. The 300-yard diameter disk. Slowly, it was turning the smooth metal surface, reflecting the dazzling sunlight. A swept-wing Tidov V Zeus craft floated a short distance away in the same orbit, and very close to it was almost like an orb in Ares IB, the packhorse of space, which landed on the moon with shocks like 4 short legs stretched out to one side. The Orion 3 spacecraft was descending from one of the higher orbits, from which the view of the Earth behind the space station looked particularly spectacular. Floyd was 20,000 miles from Earth at this point and could see a good portion of Africa as well as the Atlantic Ocean. Despite the thick cloud cover, he could make out the blue-green outer edge of the Gold Coast. The center shaft of the space station had its docking arm extended and was now slowly swimming toward them. The center shaft itself was not rotating, or, alternatively, it could be said that he was turning in the opposite direction of the station's rotation at the same speed. Thus, an alien spacecraft could dock with it and transfer passengers or cargo without risking a sharp flip. The spacecraft docked with the station with only a very slight collision. There was the noise of scraping metal on the outside, followed by the brief hiss of equalizing air pressure. After a few seconds, the airlock door opens. A man walked towards the cockpit. He was dressed in light, form-fitting pants and a short-sleeved shirt, which had become almost a uniform for space station personnel. It's a pleasure to meet you, Dr. Floyd. I'm Nick Miller, space station guard. I'm in charge of your safety until you return on the original ship. After they shook hands, Floyd smiled at the stewardess and said, "Please give my regards to Captain Tynes and thank him for the safe journey. Maybe I'll see you again on the way back." With great care, it had been more than a year since he had last been weightless, and it would take a while to get used to walking in space. He crossed the airlock with alternating hands on the wall floor and entered the station's large round room at the center shaft. The room was thickly padded all around and the walls were covered with recessed handles. Floyd held on to one of the handles, at which point the entire room began to rotate, gradually synchronizing itself with the station. As the room spun faster, gravity began to grab him vaguely like a finger, and he slowly drifted down to the circular wall. Now he stood still, his body swaying gently back and forth like a piece of seaweed in a rising tide, his feet on the spherical floor that had magically appeared. The centrifugal force of the space station's rotation grasped him. The force was still small at this point because it was so close to the axis, and as he moved outward, that force increased accordingly. He followed Miller down a spiral staircase from the center transition room. At first, he weighed so little that he had to grab the handrail and almost force himself down. It wasn't until he reached the passenger lounge on the exterior of the large rotating disc that he regained enough weight to be able to move around normally. Since his previous visit, the lounge had been rearranged and several new facilities had been added. In addition to the usual soft chairs, coffee tables, dining room, and post office, there was now a barber's room, a pharmacy that also sold groceries, a movie theater, and a souvenir store. The latter sells photographs and slides of lunar and planetary landscapes, guaranteed to be authentic from lunar satellites such as Ranger and Discovery, in elaborate plastic frames, and extremely expensive. "Would you like something to eat while we wait?" Miller asked. "We'll be on board in about 30 minutes. I could do with a cup of coffee, no milk, 2 sugars, and I'd like to make a phone call to Earth." The Russian astronomer, a tall, thin man with light yellow hair and a face so unwrinkled that you couldn't tell he was 55 years old, had spent the last 10 years building a large radio observatory on the backside of the moon, which, because it was separated by a 2,000-mile thick layer of hard rock, was immune to interference from the electronic noises of the Earth. "Hey, Haywood," he said, while shaking hands tightly. "What a cosmic place to meet. How's your health? How are the lovely children?" We're all right. Floyd replied cordially, but also a little distractedly. We've often talked about your hospitality last summer. His failure to sound more cordial made him a little less comfortable. Once Dmitri had come back to Earth and had hosted them for a week's vacation together in Odessa, and had indeed had a great time. What about you? I take it you're going up? Dmitri asked. Yeah, I take off in half an hour, Floyd replied. Do you know Mr. Miller? The guard came over at that moment, standing respectfully to one side with a plastic cup full of coffee in his hand. Of course I recognize it. But never put the coffee down, Mr. Miller. This is Dr. Floyd's last chance for a good drink. Don't let it go. No, don't push it. They followed Dmitri from the main hall of the lounge to the lookout room, then took a seat at a table to watch the moving images of the stars in the dim light. The Space One station turned 1 revolution per minute, and the centrifugal force generated by this slow rotation constituted an artificial gravitational force equal to that on the Moon. Experience has shown that this is a pretty good compromise between Earth's gravity and total weightlessness. Moreover, it gives travelers to the Moon a process of acclimatization. Outside the windows, which were almost out of reach, the Earth and the stars and buckets passed in silent parade. At this point, this side of the station has its back to the sun. Otherwise, it would be impossible to look out, because the lounge would be exposed to the sun. Even with its back to the sun, the sunlight reflected from the Earth illuminates half the sky, flooding all but the brightest stars. As the station turns along the orbit to the dark side of the Earth, the planet gradually loses ground. In a few minutes, it will be a giant black disk, with city lights shining everywhere. Then the sky will be dominated by stars. Dmitri said, already draining his first drink in one gulp and shaking the second in his hand. What's with the epidemic that has been rumored in the American sector? I was going to go to the American sector this time. No way, Professor, they told me. We're sorry, but there's a strict isolation and quarantine in effect, and we'll announce when it opens. Everything back door I went to. No way. Now please tell me what's going on. Floyd was annoyed inside. Here we go again, he thought. I can't wait to get on the road at once. Fly to the Moon. Alas, isolation and quarantine are purely routine precautions, he said cautiously. We're still not sure it's necessary, but it's good to be careful. But what exactly is the disease? What are the manifestations? Is it from an off-Earth source? Do we need help from our medical community? I'm sorry, Dmitri, asking that we not talk about anything right now. Your offer to help is appreciated, and we're dealing with it. Well, Dmitri said, clearly incredulous. It seems a bit odd to me that you, an astronomer, were sent to the Moon to investigate an epidemic. My being an astronomer is a thing of the past. Haven't done any more research in years. I'm a scientific expert now, and that means I don't know anything about anything. So do you know what TMA1 refers to? Miller seemed close to choking on his drink, but Floyd was stronger. Without even batting an eyelid, he stared straight at his old friend and said quietly, TMA1. What a strange word. Where did you hear that? Never mind that, retorted the Russian. You can't fool me. But if you run into anything you can't deal with, I hope you won't tarry too long before you cry for help. Miller deliberately looked at his watch. It's time to board in 5 minutes, Dr. Floyd. He said, I guess we'd better get started. Though he knew they had a full 20 minutes left, Floyd rushed to his feet. It was too much of a rush, because he'd actually forgotten that there was only 1/6 of the gravity here. He grabbed the table and managed not to float out. It's good to see you, Dmitri, he said, not quite meaning it. I hope you have a safe trip to Earth. I'll call you when I get back. It was only after they had left the rest hall and passed through the American side of the transshipment barrier that Floyd said, Scary, that was close. Thanks for the ride. I understand, Doctor, said the guard, and I really hope he's not right. About what? About us running into things we can't deal with. That, Floyd replied firmly, is what I want to know. 45 minutes later, the Ares IB-style lunar spacecraft took off from the station. There was none of the effort and rush of a takeoff, as on Earth the low-thrust plasma jet engines poured a stream of charged air into space, producing only an almost inaudible whistling sound, as if from far away. The gentle push lasted for more than 15 minutes, and the slow acceleration didn't interfere with the movement of people around the ship. But as soon as the thrust stopped, The ship was no longer constrained by the Earth as it had been when it was coupled to the station. It was free of gravity and became a free and independent planet, revolving around the sun in its own orbit. The cabin in which Floyd was traveling alone at this time was designed to hold 30 passengers. He felt a little uncomfortable looking at the empty seats around him, and also rather lonely, especially with the attentive attention of the male and female stewards, not to mention the pilot, co-pilot, and 2 mechanics. He doubted if anyone in history had ever received such special care, and probably would not again in the future. He recalled the cynical words of a pope with a less than stellar reputation who had once said, "Since we have the papacy in our hands, we might as well enjoy the power." Well, he'd come to enjoy the ride and the comfort of weightlessness as well. Being free of gravity, he was also simultaneously, at least temporarily, free of life's troubles. Someone once said, "You may be frightened in space, but you will never be upset in space." That is perfectly true. It seems that the stewardesses were determined to keep him eating non-stop for all 25 hours of the trip, and he had to continuously refuse dishes that were brought to him over and over again. Contrary to the ominous predictions of early astronauts, eating in the absence of gravity was not a problem. He was seated at an ordinary dining table, with cups and plates fixed to the table, as in a ship sailing on a bumpy ocean. The various dishes carried a bit of stickiness, or they would fly apart and float around the hold. Thus the pork chops had to be stuck to the plate with a thick sauce, and the salad had to be tossed with a gelatinous composition. With care and a bit of finesse, there are few things that cannot be handled safely. Only hot soups and particularly fragile pastries are off-limits. Drinks are, of course, another matter. All liquids should be contained only in plastic squeeze tubes. The design of the lavatory painstakingly worked out by a whole generation of heroic but unpraised volunteers can now be said to be essentially flawless. Shortly after the start of freefall, Floyd makes some investigations. He went in and found it fitted with the usual airplane lavatory fittings, but illuminated by a red light that irritated the eyes unbearably. A notice in large letters said, "For your comfort, please read the following instructions carefully." Floyd sat down, as is customary even in weightlessness, and read the announcement several times. After ascertaining that nothing had been changed since his previous trip, he pressed the start button. One of the motorized scooters on the left began to run, and Floyd revealed himself to be moving at this point. Like the announcement says, he closes his eyes and waits. A minute later, a soft bell rings, and he opens his eyes and looks around. The lights then turned a comforting pinkish-white color. But, more importantly, he was again subjected to gravitational forces. Only a very faint flutter indicated that this was a pseudo-gravity, caused by the whole toilet cubicle turning like a roulette-wheel Trojan horse. Floyd casually picked up a bar of soap and watched it fall in slow motion. He judged the centrifugal force at this point to be about 1/4 that of normal gravity. But it was enough. It would keep everything moving in the right direction, which was crucial in a toilet. He took the stop, ready-to-go button and closed his eyes again. As the rotation stopped and the gravitational pull slowly disappeared, the bell rang twice softly and the red alarm light came back on. The door was then secured into the correct position, allowing him to slide into the cabin, and as soon as he was inside, he attached himself to the carpet as quickly as possible. He had long since lost the novelty of weightlessness, and was glad that a pair of Velcro penny loafers enabled him to walk almost as usual. Even just sitting and reading was enough of a diversion for him. If he got tired of reading official reports, memos, and records, he connected a letter-sized news pad to the ship's intelligence line, so that he could browse the latest news from Earth. He could call up one of the world's major electronic newspapers after another like a spell. He had memorized the call signs of all the more important ones without having to check the schedules printed on the back of the pad in his hand. He switched on the short-term memory device on the display and quickly skimmed the big headlines on the first page, remembering which ones were worth reading. Each story had its own 2-digit symbol. Press the symbol, and the postage stamp size story expanded to exactly the size of the screen and could be read comfortably. When you finished reading one, you can dial back to the full page and pick another one to read in detail. From time to time, the captain and other members of the crew came into the cockpit and had a few words with him. They were, to say the least, in awe of the distinguished guest, and no doubt curious as to the purpose of his visit, but were too polite to ask questions, or even to hint at them. Only the sweet little stewardess seemed uninhibited in his presence. Freud soon realized that she had come from Bali, and had brought a certain quietness and mystery of that largely unspoiled island to this sky beyond. The most novel and mesmerizing memory of his trip was when she performed certain classical Balinese dance movements in the absence of gravity, with the deficient blue-green toothed earth in the background. There was a period of sleep en route when the main lights in the cabin went out, and Floyd wrapped his arms and legs in an elastic sheet, rabbiting himself to float off into mid-air. The arrangement seemed rudimentary, but, in the absence of gravity, his mattress-less berth was more comfortable than the most luxurious upholstery on Earth. After he was wrapped up, he went to sleep fairly quickly, but awoke once in a haze, for a moment comprehending the strange surroundings in which he found himself. For a moment he felt as if he had entered a half-lit, half-darkened Chinese palace lamp. The dim light from the square seats all around him gave rise to the illusion. He then said to himself, firmly and effectively, "Sleep, boy. This is only an ordinary moon landing." He woke up with the moon having swallowed half the sky and the braking action about to begin. The wide, curved windows in the oddly shaped walls of the cockpit were facing the sky at this point, not the approaching moon, so he stepped into the control room. Here, through the rear-view television screen, he could observe the final stages of the landing. The approaching mountains of the moon are very different from the peaks of the Earth. They are not covered with dazzling snow, they do not have a fitted garment made of green plants, and they are not crowned by floating clouds. However, the strong contrast between light and shadow gives the mountains of the moon their own special beauty. The descending craft floated close to the line dividing day and night, overlooking a jumble of rugged shadows, a lone, independent peak shimmering and glowing in the slowly unfolding lunar dawn. Though it would be scary enough to land in such a place, relying on the possible boost of all the electronics. They did not land, but slowly drifted away and floated toward the backside of the moon. Floyd realized, as his eyes adjusted to the dimmer light, that the back of the moon was not entirely dark. It shimmered in a ghostly light, with peaks and valleys and plains still visible. The Earth, like a giant moon of the moon, shed its light on the land below. On the pilot's dashboard, the radar screen lights flickered on and off, and numbers on the computer monitor recorded the distance to the approaching moon. As the jet engines began a slight but steady deceleration, the weight was gradually regained, and the moon was still more than 1,000 miles away. After what seemed like an eternity, the moon slowly expanded across the sky. The sun dropped beyond the horizon, and finally a huge crater filled the view. The ship descended toward the peaks of the crater one by one, and suddenly Floyd noticed a bright light near one of the peaks that was flashing at a certain frequency. It was like the navigation lights of an airport on Earth, and he gazed at it, his throat tightening unconsciously. It meant that man had established another foothold on the moon. By this time, the crater was much more enlarged, the surrounding barriers were slipping beyond the horizon, and the countless smaller craters within the crater were beginning to reveal their true sizes. Some of them, while appearing very small from the far reaches of space, were in fact miles wide, capable of holding several large cities. The ship glided down from the stars under automatic maneuvers and landed toward a barren landscape with the Earth in the sky like a convex moon sprinkled with silver light. Someone shouted over the whine of the jet engines, and there was a loud electronic beep from the cockpit. Clavius Base Control Tower reporting TAC-14. Your descent is going well. Please manually check the landing gear moving gates, water pressure, and shock pad air pressure. The pilot pressed a variety of switches one by one, all of which lit up green, and he called back, "All manual checks are complete. Landing gear moving gates, water pressure, and shock pad air pressure normal." "Got it," replied the moon. The descent continued in silence. Though conversations still abounded, they were all now kept in touch with each other by machines, with oppositely flashing pulses 1,000 times faster than the communication links between slow, thinking people making machines. Some of the peaks were already higher than the airship, only a few thousand feet above the ground, and the navigation lights were bright as stars, shining above a group of short buildings and alien vehicles. In the final stages of the landing, the jet engines seemed to play a strange kind of music, the engines spun and stopped, making one last delicate adjustment to the dive. Suddenly, a whirlwind of dust covered everything. The jet engines gave a final puff of air, and the ship rocked gently, like a rowboat rippling through the microwaves. It took a few minutes for Floyd to truly comprehend the serenity that enveloped him and the faint gravitational pull on his limbs. In a little more than a day, he had accomplished in absolute safety the unimaginable journey that man had dreamed of for 2,000 years. For him, it was no more than an ordinary routine voyage, and he has now landed on the moon. Nestled in the center of the southern highlands, 150 miles in diameter, Clavius is the second-largest crater on the moon's front. It is so old that centuries of volcanic eruptions and bombardments of cosmic matter have left scars and pockmarks on the walls and base of the crater. But while debris from the planetary belt is still crashing into the inner planets since the last era of crater formation, the place has enjoyed peace for 500 million years. Now there are new and strange vibrations above and below its surface as mankind heads here to establish their first permanent bridgehead on the moon. The base of Clavius is completely self-sufficient in case of emergency. The local rock is crushed, heated, and chemically processed to produce all the necessities of life. Hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, all of these, as well as most other elements, can be found in the moon, if one only knows how to look for them. The base is a self-contained system, much like an active model of the Earth itself, where all the chemical changes of life take place. In a huge greenhouse, a circular room buried on the surface of the moon, the air is purified. Illuminated by lights at night and filtered sunlight during the day, acres of thriving green plants grow in a warm, moist environment. They were all special variants, modified specifically for the express purpose of supplementing the air with oxygen, while also providing sustenance as a byproduct. More food is produced through chemical processing systems and algal blooms. While the green scum that circulates in long, clear plastic tubes is hardly appetizing to gourmets, biochemists can transform it into pork chops and steaks that can't be faked only in the presence of an expert. The team of 1,100 men and 600 women on the base were scientists and technicians who had been carefully selected and highly trained before leaving Earth. Although the hardships, inconveniences, and occasional dangers of the early days have now been largely eliminated from life on the moon, there is still a considerable psychological strain, and those with abnormal nerves who are claustrophobic are better off without it. Because of the expense and time involved in excavating large underground bases in solid rock or compacted lava, the standard living space for a single person here is a room 6 feet wide, 10 feet long, and 8 feet high. Each room is attractively decorated, much like a suite in a high-class motel, with multi-purpose sofas, televisions, small hi-fi radios, and video phones. Not only that, but by a simple trick of interior decorating, an entire wall can be transformed into a realistic view of the Earth at the flick of a switch. There are 8 different options for this view. This type of luxury was a hallmark of this base, although it was sometimes difficult to convince people on Earth of the necessity. Every man or woman on Clavius had spent $100,000 on training, travel, and housing. It was worth spending a little more to keep them mentally sound. This is not art for art's sake, but art to keep the mind and spirit sound. One of the attractive features of life on the base, and living on the whole moon as well, is undoubtedly the low gravity, which creates a general sense of well-being. This, however, has its dangers, and it takes weeks for immigrants moving from Earth to adjust. On the moon, the human body has to learn a whole new set of reactions. The human body needs to distinguish between mass and weight for the first time. A man who weighs 180 pounds on Earth may feel quite happy when he goes to the moon and finds that he weighs only 30 pounds. As long as he maintains an equalized speed and moves along a straight line, he will feel a magical sense of floating. But as soon as he has to think of turning a corner or stopping suddenly, then he will find that his 180 pounds of mass, or inertia, is still there. For the mass is fixed and unchanging. It is the same on the Earth, on the moon, on the sun, or in free space. Therefore, before one can be properly adapted to lunar life, one must understand that the inertia of all objects is 5 times greater than their weight suggests, and that it often takes many rushes and severe knocks to appreciate this, and that the old hands on the moon always stay away from newcomers until they get used to them. The base of Clavius was a small world in itself, with its own set of workshops, offices, warehouses, computing centers, power generation facilities, garages, kitchens, laboratories, and food processing plants. It is significant that much of the technology used to build this underground empire was developed during the half-century-long Cold War. Those who have worked in stationary missile sites will feel comfortable coming to Clavius. The same technology and equipment adapted to the protection of underground life and hostile environments existed on the moon. Here, however, they had been used for peaceful purposes. After 10,000 years, mankind has finally found a cause as exciting as war. Unfortunately, not all nations had recognized that fact. The great mountains that had stood out so prominently before the landing had ducked beyond the small arc lunar horizon and mysteriously disappeared. Around the spacecraft was a flat gray plain, illuminated by the slanting Earthlight. The sky was dark, of course, but first one had to shield one's eyes with one's hand from the flashes of light from the moon's surface before one could see the brighter stars and planets. Several very odd vehicles were coming towards the Ares IB spacecraft: cranes, loaders, refueling, and maintenance trucks, some fully automated, some operated by drivers sitting in small pressurized cabs. Most of the vehicles traveled on balloon-type tires, since this smooth, flat plane presented no transportation difficulties. But one of the refueling trucks was on special deformable wheels, which had proved for practice to be one of the best all-around ways to operate on the moon. This wheel, which consists of a series of flat discs in a circle, each disc being mounted separately and independently of the other, has evolved from the track and has also many of the advantages of the track. It can adjust its shape and diameter to the terrain and, unlike a track, can continue to run even if a few sections fall off. A medium-sized sedan topped with a short, thick, nose-like stretchable skin tube was sniffing adoringly at the spaceship. A few seconds later, there was a ping-ponging, puffing sound from the outside of the ship, followed by a hissing intake sound, and the air pressure evened out on both sides of the connection. The inner door of the airlock opened, welcoming the delegation into the ship. At the head of the delegation was Ralph Holverson, the administrator of the Southern Province, and by the Southern Province I mean not only this base, but any expedition from it. With him came Roy Michaels, his chief scientist, a small, graying geophysicist whom Floyd had met on several previous visits, and several senior scientists and administrators. They welcomed Floyd with an air of respectful relief. It was clear that everyone, from the chief executive onwards, had been looking forward to this day when someone would come to share their worries. "Very glad to have you among us, Dr. Floyd," Holverson said. "Did you have a good trip?" "Great," Floyd replied. "Couldn't be better. The crew took good care of it." As the limousine drove away from the spacecraft, Floyd accosted them with the usual pleasantries. It was understood that no one would mention the purpose of his trip. 1,000 feet from the landing site, the vehicle approached a large placard that read, "Welcome to Base Clavius U.S. Aerodynamic Engineering Team 1994." The limousine drove into a trench opening and then quickly descended below ground level. A giant door opens in front of it, and the car drives through and closes it again. Door after door, then a third. After the last door closed, there was a loud roar of air, and it was back into the atmosphere once again, into a base so hot you could only wear a shirt. Then there was a short passageway full of pipes and cables, with a rhythmic thud and vibration like the echo of a valley. Through the passage they came to the administrative department, and Floyd found himself back in the familiar scene of typewriters, office computers, female staff, charts on the wall, and jangling telephones. They stopped in front of the door that said Administrator's Office, and Holverson said diplomatically, "Dr. Floyd and I will be in the briefing room in a few minutes." The others nodded their heads in agreement and moved forward down the passage. But before Holverson could get Floyd into his office, he was interrupted. The door opened, and a little girl leaped up to the administrator. "Dad, you went up there. You promised to take me." "Don't, Diana," said Holverson, with a tiresome mildness of tone. "I only meant to take you if possible, but I'm busy greeting Dr. Floyd. Come and shake hands with the doctor, he's just come from Earth." The little girl, about 8 years old, Floyd judged, held out a lazy hand. She looked vaguely familiar, and Floyd detected a mischievous smile on the administrator's face as she looked at him. A startling recollection suddenly dawned on him. I can't believe it, he cried. She was still in my arms the last time I was here, nah. She turned 4 weeks old last week, Holverson replied proudly, and in low gravity. Children grow up fast. But they age slowly, they'll outlive us. Floyd looked at the confident little girl with a few moments of confusion, noting her urbane physique and unusual lightness of bone. It's good to see you again, Diana, he said. Then, involuntarily, perhaps out of pure curiosity, perhaps due to politeness, added, do you want to go to Earth, too? Her eyes rolled in surprise. Then she shook her head. It's a nasty place. One fall and you have to get hurt. Besides, there are too many people there. It seems, thought Floyd, that this is the first generation of cosmopolitans born. There will be more in the years to come. Though this thought contained sadness, it also contained great hope. When the moon is tamed, settled, and perhaps a little tired of collapsing, there will still be a place for freedom-loving people, tough pioneers, and adventurers who can't sit still. But their tools will not be axes, guns, canoes, and horse-drawn caravans. They will be nuclear power plants, plasma drives, and soilless farms. The day is not far off when the Earth, like all mothers, will send its children on a journey. With a lot of scaring and wishing, Holverson finally got rid of his stubborn offspring and then let Floyd into his office. The chief executive's suite was only 15 square feet, but surprisingly, it was fitted with all the furnishings and insignia befitting a $50,000 annual salary and ministerial status. Signatures of important political figures, including the President of the United States and the Secretary General of the United Nations, hung on one wall, and another wall was filled with autographed photographs of famous astronaut guests. Floyd sat bolt upright in a comfortable leather chair and was handed a glass of sherry, a gift from the lunar biochemical manufacturing plant. How's it going, Ralph? Floyd asks, taking a careful sip first, then continuing to sip slowly with satisfaction. It's not too bad, Holverson replied, but there's something you'd better know before you go there. What is it? Well, I guess you could call it a morale problem, Holverson said with a sigh. Oh, it's not serious yet, but it's getting close. News blackout, Floyd said bluntly. Right, Holverson replied. These guys of mine are kind of holding back on that. In any case, most of them had relatives on Earth. Relatives who probably thought they'd all died of the moon plague. I'm sorry about that, Floyd said, but no one could think of a better cover story, and it's worked so far. By the way, I ran into Moisevich at the space station, and even he believes it. Well, the defense should be happy to hear that. Don't get too happy he's heard about the TMA-1. Rumors are leaking out, but we mustn't release any statements until we know what the heck that thing is, and whether our Chinese friends are behind it. Dr. Michaels thinks he has the answer. He can't wait to tell you about it. Floyd drained his drink. I can't wait to hear him speak. Let's go. The briefing took place in a rectangular room. The room was large and had more than enough room for 100 people. A total of 40 or 50 people were waiting for Floyd, and everyone politely stood up as he walked in after the administrator. Floyd nodded his head in greeting to a few acquaintances as he whispered to Holverson, I'd like to say a few words before the briefing. Amidst a soft round of applause that signaled politeness, Floyd stepped up to the podium, smiled a little at the audience in all directions, and said, Thank you, I'd just like to say a few words. The President has asked me to convey his regard for your work, and we hope that the world will soon judge it correctly. I fully realize, he went on carefully, that some of you, perhaps most of you, are anxious to have the present state of secrecy lifted from above. You would not be scientists if you did not think so. Think so? You would not be scientists. He then caught a glimpse of Dr. Michaels, whose face, wrinkled by a slight frown, showed more distinctly a long scar on his right cheek, the result, it was said, of a cosmic crash. He was fully aware that the geophysicist had been protesting against what he called the boring secrecy of cops and robbers. But I should warn you all, continued Floyd, that this is a rather peculiar situation. We must be absolutely certain of the facts, and if we make a mistake this time, there may not be another chance, so isn't it a good idea to be patient a little longer? That's what the President wants. That's all I have to say. Now get ready to hear your reports. He walked back to his seat. The administrator said, Thank you very much, Dr. Floyd, and then nodded rather bluntly to his chief scientist. Dr. Michaels stepped up to the podium as the chief indicated. at which point the lights turned dim. A picture of the moon was reflected on the screen. In the center of the disk-like moon was a bright white crater, from which a rather prominent form of light was emitted in all directions. At first glance, it looked as if someone had dumped a bag of flour on the surface of the moon, sending it flying in all directions. In this vertical picture, Michael said, pointing his finger at the crater in the center, Tycho is even more obvious than when viewed from the Earth. From the Earth, it is closer to the edge of the moon. But, viewed from this angle perpendicularly from 1,000 miles above, everyone can see that it dominates this entire hemisphere. After letting Floyd get an impression of the unfamiliar side of this familiar object, he went on to say, over the past year, we've been taking magnetic measurements of this strip from low-altitude satellites. It was just completed last month, and this is the result of it, the same map that has caused so much trouble. Another image was on the screen. It looked like a contour map, but it showed the strength of the magnetic force rather than the altitude. Most of the curves were roughly parallel and far apart. However, in one corner of the map, the curves were clustered in a series of concentric circles like the shape of knotholes in a piece of wood. It is obvious, even to the layman, that something special has happened to the moon's magnetic field in this part of the planet. Across the lower part of the map, in large letters, is written, Tetrarch Magnetic Field Alteration Figure I, TMA1. It is stamped confidential in the upper right corner. At first we thought it might be a protruding magnet, but all the geological data proved the contrary. Moreover, even a large nickel-iron meteorite could not produce such a strong magnetic field. So we decided to go to the site and observe it. The first expedition found nothing, only unusual plains, buried under a thin layer of moon dust. They cut down a rig right in the middle of the magnetic field to extract cores for study. To a depth of 20 feet, the rig stopped, so the team started digging, and I'll bet it wasn't easy in a spacesuit. What they found caused them to return to base swiftly. We sent another larger group with more advanced equipment. They dug for 2 weeks, the results of which everyone already knows. The dimly lit conference room suddenly fell silent, waiting for the picture to change on the screen. Although everyone has seen it many times, no one has failed to probe forward as if hoping to discover new details. Fewer than 100 people on Earth and the moon have so far been allowed to see this one image. The picture shows a man in a bright red and yellow spacesuit standing at the bottom of an excavated pit, holding a measuring tape with a metric inch mark engraved on it. The picture is apparently a nighttime photograph that could have been taken from any part of the moon or Mars. But, to date, such a scene has never been produced on any planet. Behind the man in the spacesuit stood a slab of pitch-black matter, about 10 feet high and 5 feet wide. It reminded Floyd ominously of a giant tombstone. TMA1, declared Dr. Michaels, with a tone in his voice that was almost like reverence. It looks brand new, doesn't it? No wonder some people say it was made only a few years ago, and try to link it with the third Chinese expedition of 1998. But I never thought so, and now we've been able to date it absolutely, based on the local geology. My colleagues and myself, Dr. Floyd, can vouch for our reputations. TMA1 has nothing to do with the Chinese. Indeed, it had nothing to do with human beings either, for when it was buried here, there were no human beings. You know, it's almost 3 million years old. What you see before you is the first evidence of intelligent life outside of Earth. Great Rim Province, from near the center of the moon's front face southward, east of the Central Rim Province. The craters, which are densely populated by external forces, may be very large, including the largest craters on the moon. In the north, some craters have been shattered into fragments, forming so-called rain seas. Landing and movement. Landing is generally difficult due to the rugged, sloping surface. It is relatively less difficult in some horizontal craters. Movement is possible almost everywhere, but requires a choice of paths to follow, which is easier on some flat crater bottoms. Construction. Generally difficult due to slope and many large pieces of loose material. Excavation is difficult in the lava rock at the bottom of some crater valleys. Tycho, a post-Maria crater, 54 miles in diameter, with walls 7,900 feet higher than the surrounding area and valleys 12,000 feet deep. It has the most prominent optical radiation system on the moon, with some rays spreading 500 miles. Excerpted from Special Survey of the Surface of the Moon, Special Survey of the Surface of the Moon, U.S. Geological Survey, Bureau of Engineers, Department of the Army, Washington, D.C., 1961. At this point, the active laboratory, traveling at 50 miles per hour on the cratered plains of the Moon, looked very much like an oversized trailer mounted on 8 deformed tires. But it was much more than that. It was a completely self-contained base in which 20 men could live and work for weeks. Truly, it was a spaceship that traveled on land, and in an emergency, it could literally take to the air. If it approached a fault or canyon too large and steep to navigate, it could use its 4 base jet engines to fly over the obstacle. Floyd looked out the window and could see a rutted road unfolding in front of him, dozens of vehicles leaving crushed and knotted tracks on the Moon's friable surface. Along the way, equidistant from each other were thin, tall poles, each with flashing lights hanging from them. It was still late at night, and the sun would not rise for another couple of hours, yet no one could get lost on the 200-mile journey from the base of Clavius to TMA-1. Compared to a clear night in New Mexico or on the Colorado Plateau, the starry sky here is only slightly brighter, with more stars. But there are 2 things in the dark sky that make it impossible to mistake the body for the Earth. One was the Earth itself hanging like a burning torch in the northern sky. The light radiating down from that huge hemisphere, dozens of times brighter than the full moon, cast a ghostly blue-green chill over the land. The second sky oddity was a cone of dark red light slanting to the east. The closer it gets to the horizon, the brighter the light becomes, vaguely revealing roaring fires in places unseen beyond the moon's edge. It's a pale sight rarely seen by humans from Earth, and only glimpsed during total eclipses. This is the corona, the morning sun on the moon, signaling that the sun will soon shine on this sleepy land. Floyd, Holverson, and Michaels were sitting in the lookout room at the front end, just below the driver's desk. Floyd's thoughts turned away from the 3-million-year-wide chasm that appeared before him. 3 million years. By contrast, the ever-changing history of the world, the rise and fall of emperors and generals, is but a matter of moments. Not only mankind, but all the animals that now live on the Earth, did not yet exist then, just when this black monster was carefully buried in this most remarkable and prominent cratered valley on the moon. That it was buried, and consciously buried, Michaels leaves no doubt. At first, he explained, I was very hopeful that it marked the location of some underground construction, but recent excavations have ruled out that possibility. It sits on a broad platform made of the same black substance, with untouched rock all beneath it. Those who designed it, the creatures, wanted to make sure it stayed buried unless there was a strong earthquake. Those creatures are taking the long view. There was a touch of pride in Michael's tone, yet also a touch of sadness. Freud could empathize with both. One of mankind's oldest questions had finally been answered. This was the proof, the unquestionable proof, that man was not the only intelligent being in the universe, and it was painful to realize how far back in time it was. What has happened here has been unknown in the world for hundreds of thousands of generations. This may not be a bad thing, Freud thought. And yet how much could our ancestors have learned from these creatures that roamed the universe when they were still nesting in the trees? A few hundred yards directly ahead, on a horizon surprisingly close to the moon, a signpost was getting closer. There was a tent-like structure at the base of the signpost, wrapped in glittering silver foil, apparently for protection from the blazing heat of the day. As the car passes, Floyd can see in the brilliant ground light that the signpost reads, 3RD Relief Replenishment Station Liquid Oxygen 20 kilograms Water 10 kilograms Mk.4 Food Packages 20 Class B Toolboxes 1 Clothing Repair Kit 1 set. Have you thought about this? Floyd points his finger out the window and asks, is this a stash left behind by an unaccounted-for expedition? It's possible, Michaels admitted. That magnetic field does mark its location, and it's easy to find. But it's not a big one. It can't hold much in the way of provisions. Why can't it fit? Holverson interjected. Who knows how big these creatures are? Maybe they're only 6 inches tall. Then this repository would be 20 or 30 stories high. Michaels shook his head. Impossible, he retorted. Intelligent creatures can't be small. It takes a mind of at least a certain size. Freud noted that Michaels and Holverson generally always held opposing views. Yet there appeared to be little animosity or friction between the two men. They seemed to respect each other and simply recognize that they cannot agree. Regarding TMA1, some people like to call it the Tetron board, so as to retain some of its abbreviated letters at the same time, Tetron board. The first letters of each word are T and M, respectively, the same as the first two letters in the acronym TMA1. Certainly no agreement could be found. In the 6 hours since he landed on the moon, Freud had heard a dozen theories, but had expressed no approval of any of them. Shrines, survey markers, tombs, geophysical instruments, these were perhaps the more common ideas, and some of those who disagreed argued about them. Many bets are made on this, so that once the truth is known, a great deal of money will have to change hands if it ever does come out. The hard black substance of the slab was impenetrable, and the efforts of Michaels and his colleagues to scrape specimens from it by gentle means had so far come to naught. They did not doubt that it could be cut in with a laser, for there was no doubt that nothing could resist this amazing concentration of energy, but it was up to Freud to decide on the use of such violent measures. He had decided to try X-rays, sound waves, neutron rays, and all the other non-destructive methods of trial and error before calling in the heavy artillery of the laser. It was the way of the savage to destroy what he did not understand. But man might still be considered a savage compared to the creatures who made the thing. Where could this creature have come from? Right on the moon? No, that is absolutely impossible. If there had been native life on this barren land, it would have been destroyed during the last period of crater formation, when most of the moon's surface reached white-hot levels. From Earth? Not at all, though perhaps not absolutely impossible. Any advanced culture on Earth, conceivably a non-human one, would have left many other vestiges of its existence during the Ice Age. If there had been, Freud thought, we would have known all about it long before we reached the moon. Thus, there were only two other possibilities: planets and stars. However, everything proved that no intelligent life existed elsewhere in the solar system. Indeed, no life at all, except on Earth and Mars. The planets close to the sun are too hot, and the planets far from the sun are too cold, unless some life has descended into the depths of the atmospheres of these planets, where the pressure reaches a few hundred tons per square inch. So perhaps these unwelcome visitors came from the stars, but that was even harder to imagine. Freud looked around at the ebony moonlit sky dotted with stars and remembered how many of his scientific colleagues had proved the impossibility of interstellar travel. The voyage from the Earth to the moon was still breathtaking, and the nearest star was hundreds of millions of times farther away than the moon. Speculation was a waste of time. He had to wait for more empirical evidence. Please fasten seatbelts and secure all moving objects, the loudspeaker on the cockpit suddenly spoke. Coming up over a steep 40-degree grade, two pillars with flashing lights appeared on the horizon, and the car passed between them. They were driving down the inner slopes of Tycho, which gradually flattened out after a few thousand feet. As they climbed down the slope, Michaels pointed toward a vast flat expanse that gradually unfolded before them. "Look, it's right over there," he shouted. Floyd nodded. He had noticed a cluster of stoplight lights a few miles ahead, and he stared at them intently as the car careened down the slope. The car was large but apparently maneuvered freely, yet Floyd was still too nervous to even breathe until he was on a level road. Now he could see a group of pressurized domed houses, temporary shelters for the field crews, glistening like silver bubbles in the ground light. Near the domes were radio towers, drilling equipment, a few parked vehicles, and a large pile of rubble, apparently excavated before the slab was found. This tiny camp in the wilderness looked lonely and fragile compared to the forces of nature that quietly surrounded it. There was no sign of life existing here, and it was not at all clear what exactly people had come here for, far from home. "You can just make out the crater," Michaels said, "just to the right of that, about 100 yards from the radio antenna. So here it is." Floyd thought to himself. By this time, the car had driven past the air-pressurized domed house to the edge of the pit. He leaned forward to get a better look, and his heart fluttered. The car began to carefully climb down the compacted gravel slope toward the bottom of the pit. Here, the TMA1 stood, exactly as he had seen it in photographs. Floyd stares for a moment, blinks, shakes his head, and resumes staring. Even in the brilliant Earth light, it was difficult to make the object out clearly. His first impression was of a flat rectangle, as good as a sheet of black carbon copy paper, almost without thickness. Of course, that was only an illusion. Although he was looking at a solid object, it reflected the light so weakly that only a circle of outline could be seen. As the car descended to the bottom of the pit, the passengers remained absolutely silent. There was a mood of awe and a suspicion of disbelief. How could one believe that such a miracle could occur anywhere else but on this dead moon? The car stopped less than 20 feet from the slab, facing sideways so that the passengers could examine it carefully. There was, however, nothing to be seen in the object except its geometrically accurate shape. It bore no markings and was all rosewood black, with no spot of lighter color. It was the true incarnation of the night, and Freud could not help thinking for a moment that it might have been formed by some special force of nature at the birth of the moon, with its blazing fires and heavy pressures. But he knew that this remote possibility had long since been explored and rejected. By some signaling device, the floodlights around the crater opening came on at once, and the bright Earthlight was dwarfed by the much more brilliant light. In the vacuum of the moon, of course, the columns of floodlights were completely invisible. They were merely overlapping dazzling white ovals whose centers were concentrated on the plates. The columns of light shone on the plates and seemed to be completely absorbed by that rosewood surface. Pandora's box. Pandora was the first woman in Greek mythology made out of clay by the sky gods. The sky gods sent a box to Pandora and forbade her to open it without permission. Pandora, out of curiosity, secretly opens the box, and all the disasters that tormented mankind fly out of the box, leaving only hope on a platter, Freud thought, suddenly feeling ominous, waiting for curious humans to open it. And what will they find when they open it? On the TMA-1 site, the main air pressurized domed building was only 20 feet in diameter and was uncomfortably crowded. Connecting the car to it by means of 2 airlock doors provided some appreciable extra living space. The 6 scientists and technicians who have been working on this work project for a long time live and work in this hemispherical, double-walled balloon. It also contains their machines and instruments, all the sustenance that cannot be placed in an external vacuum, including cooking, washing, and sanitary equipment, as well as geological specimens and a small television screen that constantly monitors the entire site. Floyd was not surprised that Holverson chose to stay in the domed building. The administrator spoke his mind with commendable candor. "I think wearing a spacesuit is an unavoidable chore," he said, "and I wear it 4 times a year to engage in each quarterly inspection test flight. If you don't mind, I'm going to just sit here and watch through the TV." Part of this prejudice is now untenable, since the latest spacesuits are many times more comfortable than the ungainly armor worn by the earliest men on the moon. Now don't take a minute to put it on, even without help, and do it quite automated. Floyd at this point puts on the 5 Malawian Quatches spacesuit that tightly encloses his entire body to protect him against the harshest environments on the moon, both in the daytime and in the darkness of the night. He was escorted by Dr. Michaels into a small airlock passage. The spacesuit stiffened almost imperceptibly when the sound of the airlock was inaudible, and he could feel himself entering the vacuum of silence. A welcome came over the radio in the spacesuit, breaking the silence. "Is the air pressure right, Dr. Floyd? Are you breathing normally?" "Very good." His partner carefully checked the pointers and data on the gauges on the outside of Floyd's spacesuit. Then he said, "Okay, let's go." In the hour since their party had arrived, the scene had changed again. The 14 days of darkness on the moon were drawing to a close, although many of the stars and the semicircular globe were still shining brightly. The corona was visible in the east, shining brightly, and suddenly the top of the radio pole, which was 100 feet higher than Floyd's head, seemed to burst into flames, reflecting the first rays of the erupting sun. They waited for the site commander and his 2 assistants to exit the airlock passage and then walked toward the pit entrance. By the time they reached the mouth of the pit, a narrow bow of incandescent, hard-to-see light was coming from the eastern horizon. The stars had disappeared, although it would be another hour before the entire sun was visible because of the Earth's slow rotation. The pit was still in dark shadow, but the floodlights set up around it illuminated the bottom. Floyd walked slowly down the slope toward the black rectangular slab, feeling not only awe, but also a sense of his own insignificance. This was only the gateway to the Earth, but mankind had been confronted with mysteries they might never be able to explain. 3 million years ago, some force had visited this place, leaving behind a symbol of its intentions, a symbol that was difficult to understand, and perhaps could never be understood before returning to the planet or star. The radio on Floyd's spacesuit interrupted his thoughts. "This is the field commander. If you'd like to stand over here, we'd like to take a few pictures." "Dr. Floyd, would you stand in the middle?" "Dr. Michaels, thank you." No one but Floyd seemed to think it was funny. Truth be told, he also had to admit he was glad someone had brought a camera. The picture was undoubtedly historic, and he wanted a few. He wished his face was visible in the helmet of his spacesuit. "Thanks, guys," the photo man said. Everyone posed a little unnaturally in front of that board as the photographer took a dozen pictures in a row. "We will ask the base photography department to distribute the photos to you all." Then Floyd turned his full attention to the black slab, circling it slowly, scrutinizing it from every angle, trying to impress upon his mind its singularity. He did not intend to discover anything, for he knew that every square inch had been scrutinized with a microscope. By this time, the slowly rising sun was already shining into the mouth of the pit, and the sun was shining on the east-facing side of the plate. However, it seemed to absorb all the grains of light as if the sunlight did not exist. Floyd decided to try a simple experiment. He stood between the plate and the sun, and then searched for himself on the smooth black bun, but there was no sign of him. The glare of the sun on the slab was at least 10 kilowatts. If it contained anything, it must have cooked quickly. How strange, Floyd thought to himself, standing here looking at this one by one thing, seeing sunlight for the first time since the beginning of the Ice Age on Earth. He mulled over its black color again, certainly ideal in absorbing solar energy. But he dismissed that thought at once. For who would be daft enough to bury a solar-powered device 20 feet underground? He looked up at the Earth, which was beginning to lose ground in the morning light. Only a few of those 6 billion people knew of the discovery. How would the world react when the news was finally released? Floyd was still lost in these reveries when suddenly the speakers in his helmet emitted a piercing electronic screech, as if it were an overloaded, badly distorted time signal. Instinctively, he tried to plug his ears with his hands in his spacesuit. Then he snapped out of it and began fumbling anxiously for the receiver controls on the radio. He was still fumbling when 4 more screams erupted. Then there was a reassuring silence. On all sides of the pit, people stood in stunned postures. So it wasn't just me with the faulty equipment, Froford said to himself. Everyone heard those electronic screams. After 3 million years of dim night, TM-A1 greeted the dawn on the moon again. 100 million miles from Mars, in a cold, lonely place where no man has ever been, the Cosmic Voyage 79 listener drifted among the intricacies of planetary orbits. For 3 years, it had accomplished its mission without error, a credit to the American scientists who designed it, the British engineers who built it, and the Russian technicians who launched it. Its lightweight, cobweb-like antennae sifted the radio sound waves that traveled to and fro, the endless crackling and sizzling that Pascal, 1623–1662 AD, French philosopher, mathematician, and physicist. Pascal, 1623–1662, French philosopher, mathematician, and physicist, in a simpler time, naively called it the silence of space. Electromagnetic wave detectors recording and analyzing cosmic rays from the Milky Way and beyond. Neutron and X-ray telescopes observing strange stars never visible to the human eye. The sun blasting out a 1,000,000-mile-per-hour stream of thin plasma at the planets circling around it, and magnetometers measuring such solar blasts and whirlwinds. All of this, and so much more, was patiently recorded by the Cosmic Voyage 79 listener, stored in its crystal-clear, unclouded memory. Stored in its crystal-clear memory. One of its antennae, now a commonplace electronic marvel, was always pointed at a point not very far from the sun. If visible to the naked eye, its distant target could be seen every few months as a star, closely followed by a fainter companion. Most of the time, this companion always disappeared into the dazzling sunlight. Every 24 hours, the listener sends back to the distant planet Earth the information it has patiently gathered and succinctly compressed into 5-minute pulses. In a quarter of an hour, the pulse, traveling at the speed of light, would reach its destination. Since the first satellites went into orbit almost 50 years ago, billions, if not trillions, of intelligence pulses have been sent back from the cosmos, all stored for future advancement of knowledge. At that moment, the Cosmic Voyage Type 79 listener recorded a curious event, a slight but noticeable disturbance reverberating throughout the solar system, completely unlike any natural phenomenon ever detected in the past. It automatically recorded the bearing, time, and intensity. The information was transmitted back to Earth a few hours later. The same information was recorded and transmitted by the orbiting satellite M15, which revolved around Mars for 2 weeks every day, by the highly inclined probe XXI, which orbited slowly above the plane of the ecliptic, and even by the artificial comet No. 5, which at this time was flying into the frigid skies far beyond Pluto, following an orbit that would take 1,000 years to reach the other side of it. All of them recorded the energy of this particular outburst of interference with the instrumentation, and all of them, in turn, were automatically sent back to the memory unit on the far side of the planet. How these 4 particular sets of signals, coming from cosmic probes millions of miles apart, each in its own separate orbit, are related, computers may never realize. However, the EMP forecasters at Goddard, USA, saw the morning reports and knew immediately that there had been an anomaly in the solar system in the past 24 hours. The flight was still only 30 days away from Earth. Yet David Bowman sometimes found it difficult to conceive of having lived on any other world than the small, closed world of Discovery. His years of training, his previous missions to the Moon and Mars, seemed like someone else's experience, a lifetime ago. It had begun 5 years earlier as the Jupiter Project, the first manned round-trip expedition to the big planet. The spacecraft for the 2-year voyage was almost ready, but, rather suddenly, the nature of the mission changed. Discovery is still going to Jupiter, but it will not stop there. It won't even slow down a bit as it traverses the vast system of Jupiter's moons. Instead, it will use the giant star's gravity as a projector, throwing itself farther away from the Sun. Like a comet, it will burst into the outer layers of the solar system and finally reach the splendor of Saturn's rings. It will never turn back. For Discovery, it was a one-way flight, yet its crew had no intention of committing suicide. If all goes well, they will return to Earth in 7 years, 5 of which, a mere fraction of a second in that long night of space, will be spent in complete hibernation, waiting for the yet-to-be-built Discovery 2 to retrieve them. Discovery 2, yet to be built, to bring them back. The word rescue is carefully avoided in all statements and documents of the word flight agencies because it implies a slight failure of the plan. The approved term is regain. If something did go wrong, there would certainly be no hope of rescue a billion miles from Earth. Like all journeys into the unknown, it is a planned adventure. However, half a century of research had proved that it was perfectly safe to put people into artificial hibernation, thus opening up new realms of possibilities in cosmic navigation. Until this mission, however, this possibility had not been fully utilized. The crew of 3 would not be required to work until they were in final orbit around Saturn, and they would be asleep for the entire one-way trip out. In this way, tons of food and other consumables could be saved, and, just as important as the savings, the crew, instead of being exhausted by the 10-month journey, would be able to begin operations refreshed and responsive. Discovery will enter a stopping orbit around Saturn, becoming a new moon for that giant planet. It will travel back and forth along a 2-million-mile elliptical orbit, approaching and straddling the orbit of Saturn's main moon. They would have 100 days to map and study this other world, the size of 80 Earths, with at least 15 known moons, one of which was about the size of Mercury. There was probably enough wonderland there to study for hundreds of years. The expedition would only be a preliminary reconnaissance. What the reconnaissance finds will be radioed back to Earth. Even if the explorers can't get back from the water, their discoveries won't be lost. At the end of 100 days, Discovery will shut down. The entire crew will go into hibernation. Only the major systems will continue to function, under the unified command of the ship's tireless computer. The spacecraft will orbit Saturn in a perfectly calculated orbit, and 1,000 years from now people will know where to find it. But, according to current plans, Discovery 2 will arrive in just 5 years. Even if 6, 7, or 8 years pass, the sleeping crew of the spacecraft will not be aware of it. For all of them, the clock had stopped just as it had for Whitehead, Kaminsky, and Hunter. At times, Bowman, as Discovery's chief pilot, envied the serenity of his 3 colleagues, who were unconscious in hibernation. They were not bored and were relieved of all responsibility. The outside world did not exist for them until they reached Saturn. The outside world, however, was watching them through physiological sensors. Between the massive instruments on the console were 5 small, inconspicuously positioned panels with the names of the 5 men written on them: Hunt, Whitehead, Kaminsky, Poole, and Bowman. The latter 2 were blank and silent. They were not to be activated until a year later. The others showed little star-shaped green lights on them, indicating that all was well. And there was also a small screen on each panel, recording the even rhythm of pulse, respiration, and cerebral activity in a glowing single curve. Most fascinating are the EEG recordings, the current characteristics of 3 people who have survived and will continue to survive at some later date. These features are almost entirely free of peaks and valleys, the electrical waves that mark the brain activity of awake people and even normal sleepers. If these people retained even a hint of sentience, it was yet beyond the reach of instruments and memory. When it comes to memory, Bowman knows from direct experience. Before he was selected for this mission, he had been quizzed on his reaction to hibernation. He couldn't be sure whether he'd lost a week of his life, or whether he'd end up with an extra week to live. As electrodes were placed on his forehead and the hypnosis machine began to churn, he saw kaleidoscopic shapes and stars floating by that were displayed for a short time. Then everything disappeared and darkness enveloped him. He never felt those sub-injections, much less the cold, as his body temperature began to drop to only a few degrees above zero. He seemed to have hardly closed his eyes when he awoke, but he knew it was an illusion. Somehow he was convinced that years had actually passed. Has the mission been completed? Had they gotten to Saturn and investigated? Have they gone into hibernation? Has Discovery 2 come to pick them up and return them to Earth? Warm air was blowing off the chill from his limbs. There was a loudspeaker above his head, broadcasting loud but stirring music. The sound slowly grew louder and louder, then a relaxed, friendly, yet he knew it was from a computer voice spoke to him. David, you are regaining mobility. Do not get up or make any violent movements. Don't talk. Don't get up. Bowman thought. That was a joke. He doubted he could stretch his fingers. To his surprise, he realized he could still stretch his fingers. He was in a groggy, dazed state, but felt quite at peace with himself. He was vaguely aware that the rescue ship must have already arrived, that the recovery process had been automated, and that the rest of the human race would soon be visible. That was great, but he wasn't thrilled by it either. After a while, he felt hungry. The computer had certainly anticipated this need. David, there is a signal button next to your right hand. If you're hungry, please press it. Bowman forced his fingertips to feel around. In a few moments, he found a pear-shaped sphere. He'd forgotten all about it, though he must have known about it. How many other things has he forgotten? Does hibernation erase memories? He pressed the electric button and waited. A few minutes later, a metal arm reached out from under the bed, and a plastic nipple came close to his lips. He jerked eagerly at it, a warm, sweet liquid flowing down his throat, each drop bringing new added strength. Though he felt his breath rapidly returning, he would have been glad to continue lying so, had there been no further external stimulus. But immediately another voice spoke to him, and this time it was entirely human, not a combination of electrical impulses assembled from superhuman memories. The tone sounded familiar, too, though it took him a while to recognize it. David, Hecko, your recovery went well. You can talk now. Do you know where you are? The question eluded him for a long time. If he really had been orbiting Saturn, what had happened in those many months since he had left Earth? However, he still didn't know where he was on his own, and the person speaking on the other end of the circuit must have understood his situation perfectly. David, don't worry. I'm Frank Poole. I'm watching your pulse and breathing one by one, and everything is perfectly normal. Just relax, take it easy. We're going to open the door and help you out." A soft light prevailed in the room. He saw moving shadows through the door that was being opened. It was in this moment that he regained his full power of memory and knew exactly where he was. Though he had traveled far to the end of his dreamland and tasted death, he had now returned safely, in fact, after only a week's time. It wasn't the cold skies of Saturn that he had seen when he broke out of hibernation. That would be a year later and 500 million miles away. For the moment, he was still in a test vehicle at the Houston Space Center in the blazing Texas heat. But at the moment, Texas was long gone, and even the United States was hard to see. Though the low thrust of the plasma stream had long since been shut down, Discovery was still gliding, its long, thin, arrow-like hull turned back toward the Earth. All of its high-energy optics pointed toward the outer planets, toward its destination. There was, however, another telescope permanently aimed at the Earth. It was mounted like a sight on the tip of the ship's long-range antennae, constantly calibrated to keep that huge bowl strictly aligned with its distant target. As long as the Earth remained in the center of the crosshair's intersection, this vital communication link could be maintained, passing messages back and forth through stealthy beams lengthening 2 million miles a day. It is difficult to recognize any geographical features on that ever-shrinking crescent, for they are often obscured by clouds, but even the darker parts of the globe are insufficient for one to see. It is dotted with towns with flickering lights, sometimes shining steadily like long lamps, and sometimes, owing to the interference of lightning, flashing like fireflies. There were also times when the moon followed its orbit from week to week, hanging like a giant lamp over the Earth's dimly lit oceans and lands. At these times, Bowman was often thrilled to recognize familiar shores for a moment in the magical moonlight. At other times, when the Pacific was really calm, he could see the moonlight glowing on the calm, mirror-like surface of the ocean, and he was reminded of moonlit nights and palms on tropical lagoons. He had no regrets, however, for all the beauty he had lost. He had enjoyed them all in his short life of 35 years, and when he was successful and well-to-do, he resolved to visit the sites again. To think of them at this moment, in a distant place, makes them all the more valuable. The sixth member of the crew was unfazed by all this because it was not human. It was a highly advanced HAL 9000 computer, the brain and nervous system of the ship. The HAL, 4-heuristic program loop-step computer, was the masterpiece that marked the third breakthrough in computing. It seems that breakthroughs occur every 20 years. The thought of another breakthrough on the horizon has made many people skeptical. The first breakthrough occurred in the 1940s, when the now obsolete vacuum tube led to the big, bulky, high-speed ENIAC and its descendants. Then, in the 1960s, solid-state microcircuits were perfected. From then on, it became clear that computers as powerful as human intelligence didn't need to be bigger than the average desk. The key was knowing how to build them. This may never be known, but it is no longer relevant. In the 1980s, the duo of Minsky and Good had demonstrated that neutral circuits could be automatically generated self-replicating according to an arbitrarily chosen program. Computers can be made to grow in a process remarkably similar to the development of the human brain. From any example, the specifics can never be known, and even if they were, they would be incomprehensible to humans because they are millions of times more complex than human comprehension. However it operates, the end result is a machine intelligence that reproduces. Some philosophers still prefer the word imitates most of the activities of the human brain, much faster and more reliably. Most of the activities of the human brain, much faster and much more reliably. It is extremely expensive to build, and only a handful of HAL 900 systems have been built so far. But the old joke that it is easier for an unskilled worker to build an organic mind sounds a little less funny now. For this mission, HAL was trained as thoroughly as his human companion, and his absorptive capacity was many times greater because, in addition to his intrinsic agility, he had no need for sleep, and his main task was to monitor the life-supporting systems, constantly checking for oxygen, pressure, temperature, leaks in the ship's hull, radiation, and all the other interacting factors necessary to keep a delicate commodity like man alive. He can perform complex navigational corrections and direct necessary flight activities when a course change is required. He can also care for people who have gone into hibernation, making the necessary adjustments to their environment and injecting into their veins minute amounts of fluids sufficient to sustain life. The first generation of computers relied on nothing more than glorified typewriter keyboards for their input and high-speed printing or visual displays for their output. Hal could do this when necessary, but most of the time his dealings with people in the same boat were by talking. Poole and Bowman can talk to Hal as if he were a real person. He could also respond in the authentic, idiomatic English that he had learned in the fleeting weeks of his electronic infancy. It was even possible that Hal might one day take over command of the ship. In the unlikely event that no one responded to his signals, he would attempt to awaken the sleeping crew through electronic and chemical stimuli. If they did not respond either, he would ask for instructions directly from Earth through radio communications. If Earth did not answer, he would do what he deemed necessary to secure the ship and continue the mission, the true purpose of which only he knew. Those of his human companions could never guess. From time to time, Poole and Bowman humorously referred to themselves as guards or janitors, since the airship was practically entirely self-manned. If they realized that the joke actually contained a large degree of truth, they would instead be shocked and greatly annoyed.